Broadcasting from the Black Licorice Studios in London, Ontario, Canada. Welcome. This is Journeys with the No Schedule Man. I'm Kevin Bulmer. We are here to celebrate and share entrepreneurs who are finding their real success and find out about what's inspired them, what's driven them forward, what are their successes, their triumphs, their challenges, what have they learned, and what can we learn from them. And today I'm really excited to connect with somebody who's been on this podcast before, Andre Radmall. We are going to make a connection all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from here in Ontario, Canada, all the way over to the United Kingdom. And I'm really excited to share Andre with you in just a couple of moments. Before we do that, I want to remind you that this podcast is available on just about all audio platforms where you can find podcasts. You can find Journeys with the No Schedule Man on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, and the video at YouTube. YouTube.com/No Schedule Man. And we've got the video up on Facebook as well. If you can remember No Schedule Man, you'll be able to find us. Would love for you to stay connected. Visit me on my website at noscheduleman.com or connect and subscribe or follow along on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now, and YouTube. The handles on all of those platforms are at No Schedule Man. I want to also say thanks to those who have supported this podcast, including Diamond and Gold Treasures. You can visit them online at diamondsgold.com, or they are here in the London, Ontario area, if you happen to be near where I am in southwestern Ontario. Mo Mondays London is the inspirational event series that I host. Hopefully we can get back to hosting the real events. In the meantime, we've been doing a series of little short online chats that we're calling 12 Mo Minutes. Mo Mondays, kind of short for Motivational Mondays, if you like. I describe it as like TEDx meets The Tonight Show with a little bit of The Muppet Show tossed in. And we really have a great time. It's a terrific experience of real people sharing real stories. You can learn more about that at momondays.com/London. Thanks to Mulligan Realty Group, the kind of realtor that you deserve. You can find them at mulliganrealtygroup.com. Provincial Glass and Mirror, Brett Lucier and their team, they've been busy with putting up partitions and keeping our workers safe and keeping our retail areas safe. Of course, they've still continued to do a lot of the work that they normally do as a professional full-service glass company here in southwestern Ontario. But as has been the case with a lot of us, they've had to pivot and learn how to do some new things here with the lockdown and the reimmersion back into society that's caused by COVID. So thanks to our great friends at Provincial Glass and Mirror and the things that they're doing. And Trickett Financial, Carol Trickett, you can learn more about her at trickettfinancial.com. In fact, I was just mentioning about that series of little vignettes that I've been doing on the Mo Mondays London channel called 12 Mo Minutes. And the most recent one that I did at the time of this recording was with Carol. And she had some really interesting things to say. I thought they were interesting about what her life has been like going into the lockdown caused by this pandemic and what it's been like for her. And in the insurance and financial industry, she was mentioning that at the start of the lockdown, that her phone rang like crazy because of people that were reaching out looking for health insurance. And then there were a lot of questions, of course, about finances and things like that. But interesting conversation, the ups and downs. We're all experiencing it in our own way. And I hope that conversations like this help. You're really going to love our guest today. I'm thrilled to be able to speak to him again. It's been a couple of years since we connected. And when we did, it was when the podcast was just an audio-only presentation. So this is the first time that we've actually had the opportunity to look at each other and have a conversation at the same time. But it really pleases me to introduce you to or reintroduce you, as the case may be, to Andre Radmall. For the last 20 years, Andre has worked as a systemic psychotherapist, life coach, dramatherapist, and educator. In recent years, he's combined his creative and therapeutic experience to provide a unique approach to coaching. Andre is an international speaker and a workshop leader. He's got a wide teaching experience. He's been over to Singapore. He's been in Kuwait, London, among others, as well as being a published author of a book on addiction, a life story coach, and a wonderful guy, and it is wonderful to see you again. Andre, thank you for joining me. How are you and your family doing these days?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you for the introduction as well. We're doing great. We're doing fine. I have three grown-up kids. They're scattered all over the UK. One's in Scotland, actually, and the others are in England. We have been affected by the COVID virus, very much in the early stages of the pandemic. Both myself and my wife caught the virus and were under the weather, not very well for a couple of weeks particularly, and then slow recovery since. So we're doing okay now, but it's we know what it's like, particularly my wife, who was a bit more ill than I was. So we've been through that experience and out the other side of it.
So you've actually contracted COVID-19.
Mm-hmm,
Wow. So
yeah.
you're one of those who has lived through it. What's, not to belabor it, but what's it been like?
To be honest, for me, it was quite mild. I had a few aches and pains. I would say that it's been a bit fatiguing, and that stayed with me a little bit. For my wife, it was a bit more serious. She had sort of fairly serious breathing problems, had a night in hospital, and then really kind of has been recovering since. So I think a lot of people are finding this, that some people have very mild symptoms or almost no symptoms, and other people get really seriously ill. So I guess that's been our experience too.
What's it been like in the UK? How's that for a broad, somewhat unfair question? Well, I don't know that I've ever, in my lifetime, and I'm 46 now, Andre, I can't think of another time where there has been something that has been such a universal challenge, no matter where you are around the globe. And yet I can't help but wonder whether or not the experience of navigating the challenges is similar. Or if it's different, how different it may be. Now, you wouldn't be able to speak to any differences from here unless I give you more context. But maybe over the last 3 months or so, what's it been like? Like, what's been the degree of shutdown and social isolation and things like that?
Well, what happened here was that we had quite a slow-ish shutdown. So we went through a little phase for maybe a week or so where we were very aware of serious problems in other countries in Europe, particularly Italy. And there was quite a lot of concern over that because it seemed that their health service was being overwhelmed. And we could sort of feel this thing coming towards us. And I don't think we felt particularly prepared. And we kind of kept things open for a little bit. So we had big race meetings, big football matches and stuff like that going on in that first week. And then it kind of shut down fairly quickly. There was a rather sudden application of the brakes, really. And what was it like? Well, I'd say for the first 2 months, easily of that time, it was super quiet. You would go out on the streets, no cars. We had people outside the house where we live here, just north of London, who would just be using the streets as a kind of thoroughfare because nobody was driving anywhere. So you'd have skateboards, cyclists, people just walking in the streets, pushing buggies, and it was a really odd shift in the whole dynamic. And of course, central London was completely shut down. So we were getting all these pictures of the centre of town, which would usually be thriving and super busy, just completely empty. Not a soul there. Very strange. And then in the last month, it's gradually changed, particularly in the last week. And this week, it's going to change again as the government's taking off some of the restrictions gradually. Of course, we've had the scenario here where I think when people feel a little bit of a lightening of the pressure, and we've had quite hot weather as well, we've had huge numbers of people rushing to the beaches. And that creates a lot of concern because tens of thousands of people congregating in a small space, it's the sort of thing that makes people start talking about a second wave happening here. But right now, the pressure is definitely relaxing, and I think it will carry on like that probably through into the autumn, and then we'll see where we are then.
What's your personal experience been like, Andre? I'm especially curious about this, given the kind of work that you do to help people through a lot of very trying situations and equip them with the kinds of tools that can help see themselves through in a healthy and positive way. But kind of back to where I was before, this is a different animal that seems to have twisted and turned each of us as we all experience it in our own ways. What's it been like for you over the last 90 days or so to navigate? And when you throw in the firsthand experience of actually living through having contracted the virus on top of all of the uncertainty and the isolation, what's it been like for you?
Well, I mean, it was pretty scary when we were encountering the virus firsthand. It seemed to get, I mean, my wife got sick first and then I got sick just afterwards, and it seemed to happen really fast and very early in the process. So it was pretty scary, to be honest, at the beginning. In a weird sort of way, it was a different kind of fear to what we had before, which was the fear of catching it, which was really palpable. I mean, people were really scared of catching it, and then we did catch it. So in a strange kind of way, that was, I wouldn't say it was easier to deal with, but it was a different kind of thing to deal with, because then we were managing our way through something that had actually happened to us. Other than that, I think navigating through the 90 days, once we got past the kind of initial thing of the illness, it's been weird. I've got to say, it's been kind of weird, because there's no kind of game plan for this. There's no roadmap for this.
Yeah.
No one's been on this journey before, so it's not like we've got any reference points that we can say, oh, by week 12, this is what will have happened, or how we cope with businesses when everything's shut down and you can't go to the office. We're in completely uncharted territory. So I think what I've found personally and in my work is the importance of being able to pivot. Pivot's a bit of a word, by the way, in the UK at the moment. Everybody's talking about pivoting.
Right.
Sort of switching from one position to another position.
I've been using that word myself. Yeah, it's spreading, not quite like COVID-19, but I've heard it. Anyway, please continue.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of that question of pivoting here for people, and I think for me personally, I've had a pivot into what, as I was saying to you before we started, I'm starting my own podcast up, which is kind of new for me, and it feels like a good pivot, a good shift for me. All of my work's gone online, all of it. So all the coaching that I do and therapeutic work is all online now. That seems to have worked out okay. And my wife is working from home. I'm working from home. So part of the strangeness is that the days can kind of drift by and we may not have gone out of the house very much. So we have to remember to go out and go for walks and things like that. Because it'd be very easy just to stay put for long periods.
I'm interested to come back to talk about those pivots, the podcast and the book and the other things besides. Before we do that, for the benefit of those who are listening or watching, I wonder if we can readdress some of the backstory a little bit, and maybe more specifically, help people understand what you would consider to be a life story coach, to even give people an idea of who Andre Radmall is and the kind of work that he does. And I'm also going to encourage people to go back and listen to the other episode that we did together, because there was a lot of great information there. But I've noticed, just from observing you from afar, that this idea, this term of life story coach, seems to me to be something that's a little bit more front and center with you than it was the last time we talked.
Yeah.
How would you describe what a life story coach is, Andre?
Okay, so absolutely correct. I think it is very front and center now. It's becoming my main way of describing what I do. I would say that even as a therapist, and I've worked as a therapist for over 20 years now, I've always been fascinated by understanding people through their stories. And so what I think a life story coach does is, to begin with, understand people's lives by looking at them rather like looking at a story. So there's usually a beginning, an origin story, a bit like in superhero movies. There's an origin story behind how people get to be where they are today. So I'm always interested in people's backstories, and then looking at how they kind of develop, particularly their own narratives about who they are, what the world's like, and those narratives tend to get quite fixed very early in life, particularly if people have had difficult experiences. They tend to generate these kind of narratives to explain the world to themselves that are often a bit fearful, a bit defensive. And by the time they come for coaching, they're probably finding that those narratives are just too stuck and not really sort of helping them with the ups and downs of life. They're kind of wanting to break out of their story and develop a new story. So I think as a life story coach, I start by understanding the stories that people are currently telling, which are usually really partial, really limited. And in fact, that's true of any story. We all live a partial account of who we potentially could be. And my job as a coach is to start to open up new possibilities, often using questions, for a new way of thinking about who the person is, what the world could be like, what other people might be like, that's different. And once people can shift their perspective or pivot, you came back to that word. I'm going to keep using it because I'm using it for my podcast, so I'm sort of subtly advertising.
What's it called? The pivot with Andre Radmall?
It's called Pivot Points, and Pivot Points with Andre. Yeah, with me. So, yeah, the rest of what I do as a coach would be to help people build new stories that they can live out successfully. And that's really an act of imagination. And I suppose that's where my creativity comes in. A lot of my backstory is working and training as a creative. I trained as an actor. I've worked as a dramatherapist, and I've also done stuff in the area of film and screenwriting and things like that. So I use all of that to help people change their stories, because once they can change their story about who they are, they can usually live out a different reality.
If we can dip a little bit back into the conversation that we had a couple of years ago, I'm curious to see if I'm recollecting accurately, Andre. But I feel like among the things that we discussed was the idea of your theatrical background and creative background being put to use in part helping people understand that playing a role or envisioning themselves in a role or even acting out a certain role or character can actually help them discover more about who they are authentically are. Am I remembering that accurately?
Yes, I think that's really the second big part of what I'm doing when I'm doing story coaching. I think essentially the answer to that is yes, because I think the short answer. The longer answer is that I think what people get stuck in is enacting a particular version of themselves that's usually quite limited, and it is based on the story that they have. So I think it's the same as being an actor. Actors have scripts that they are operating out of that confine and constrict what they can do, but they enact those scripts all the time. And it's the same for us. People are always acting out a particular version of who they think they are. So my idea really is to move from just helping people think about a different narrative to being able to enact different ways of being. And this is where my acting sort of skills are brought into the picture. So I may work with people actually to role play a different character that's completely different from who they usually are. And what's really interesting about that, and I've thought this all the way back to when I trained as a drama therapist, one of the big things I learned there was it's not being fake to do that. To be somebody else and to enact a different role is actually, as you rightly say, it's to find another part of oneself that is authentic, but to bring it to the surface and to release it into the world. What this does is it gives people much more options for how they can operate in their world. So yeah, I do see role play and acting techniques as being quite fast ways in to opening up new possibilities for people in terms of their identity.
To what extent, if at all, might being asked to fill a role or portray another character that would be different from who you would consider yourself to normally be, to what extent might that contribute to helping to see things from somebody else's perspective?
Oh, a lot. Yeah. So I think that what traps people often is the limitations of their own perspective on life.
Mm.
And that really plays out in relationships, of course. So when I'm working with couples, one of the big obstacles is people finding it hard to empathize with their partner's way of seeing things because they're very often defending their own point of view and their own perspective. So being able to, so sometimes I might do role reversal, for example, if I'm working with a couple where somebody actually has to role play their partner, and then I would ask them questions as if they were their partner. And that shows up two things straight away. One is it's incredible how people get it right, how very aware they are of the other person, more than they appear to be often. And the empathy starts to kick in. So it does actually enable people to see things from the other's perspective, and it decreases conflict and things like that quite dramatically.
I'm really intrigued by the story idea. Story, not unlike pivot, Andre. Story is a word that I hear myself using a lot. I'll say things to myself or to others about myself, such as, this may just be a story I'm telling myself, in terms of the way that I'm perceiving something.
Yeah.
Uh, but another layer to that, I think, that I was considering when you were sharing a few moments ago, and I asked you about what it is to be a life story coach.
Mm.
In thinking about people's stories and the story that they want to tell and the story that they want to live and script for their life, or the story that they've been telling, and how they can pivot that if they want, I'm looking at story and belief. Like, now we can switch out vocabulary here, I guess, but limiting beliefs, these kinds of things are also words that I used in terms of uncovering what I might be unconsciously believing about myself, that either good or bad. Shouldn't necessarily say bad, but maybe limiting in some way. How interconnected or synonymous at all would you consider those ideas of stories and beliefs about ourselves?
Yeah, I think they are pretty much in the same ballpark because, I mean, stories tend to have beliefs woven into them. So they would be things like, I am the kind of person who, because I come from this background. So I had a very limiting story myself for many years because I was adopted at birth. Because I was adopted, I developed a story about abandonment. So my story was I was abandoned, therefore, if I am not entertaining people or doing things to help people, they will abandon me because my self-worth is only based on doing something for other people. Anything short of that, there's a fair chance I'll be abandoned again, and I can't have that. Can't let that happen. So what I did there was I'd integrated some beliefs about worthlessness, abandonment, rejection. These are all sort of beliefs or schemas, as cognitive therapists would call them. I'd kind of integrated it into a little story about I was the kind of guy who this happened to me, therefore that means that this will happen in the future if I do X, Y, and Z. So I think stories kind of wrap around these sorts of beliefs in a very kind of integrated sort of way. So I think they're very closely linked.
I wonder what it's like for you and for the people that you work with when a story of theirs is brought to light that they didn't even know that they were carrying around, but in fact was running so much of how they see themselves. And to give some context to people watching and listening, I'll share a personal anecdote. In the time since we've talked last, Andre, I investigate these things about myself, maybe to a fault, but I'm quite fascinated at how there just seem to be these unending layers of discovery about oneself. In any event, it was almost exactly a year ago from the time that we're having this conversation, and I was reading about chakra energy and the personality traits that were associated with those things, and as part of that, I had a book on tape. They used to make those. I actually took this compact discs out of the library, and I had to burn them into my computer so I could put them on an iPod and listen to them in the car, because the car doesn't even have a CD player anymore. Anyway, I'm driving along a country road, and it's talking about the roots chakra tendencies of being grounded and feeling safe and feeling supported. So anybody that maybe has a story about whether they're feeling safe or supported or not, or what are they maybe running from or jumping from thing to thing to thing. And the author, the narrator, asked in that moment to, without thinking about it, name out loud what your role was in the family. And I love my family. I had a good upbringing, just straight ahead, boring old middle-class Canadian, Andre. I'd never thought about it. And I heard this, and I followed the instruction, and I blurted out without even thinking about it, oh, I was the burden. I was the burden. And it hit me. I'm almost getting emotional now. I pulled the car off the side of the road because it hit me so viscerally. I was very sick as a child with asthma and required a lot of attention from my parents. They must have been very, very scared. I was in and out of the hospital all the time. That's all in the past, and I've been well for a long time, and I haven't thought about it. But as soon as that story was revealed to me, I didn't even know that I felt like that. And yet there was an instant knowing of, oh, well, then that's why this, and this.
Yeah.
How similar or not is that to when a story gets brought to light by the people that you're working with?
I think you've hit. Yeah, I mean that's a really important point, because stories are held in our bodies. They're not just. I think probably the way I've described it so far is sounds more like it's something we think in our minds, which is true, but fundamentally stories about how we really feel about life, about who we really are in the body. And that's why I think when we're doing any kind of body work, actually, whether it's relaxation, martial arts, Tai Chi, things can get released, chakra work, that things can get released that are really fundamental to our core belief about ourselves. And so I think that when I'm talking about story coaching and working with people with roles, that's why I think the physical aspect of that is so important, because one of the big aspects of role shift is to move and to get into the body and to get into the breathing and sort of sink into the interior world physically. And in that place, I think we start to tap into the kind of stuff you're describing, which is sometimes quite buried realities. I mean, I've been quite influenced, I think, by people like Alexander Lowen and bioenergetics and things like that, where and also William Reich, an analyst who very much thought about the body as housing in the muscular system all sorts of unexpressed emotions that were very primal, very primitive, and would only kind of be accessed through physical work. So for me, yeah, absolutely, the body holds the story. And we also know from working with people who've had trauma that the body contains traumas for years and years and years until they can be brought to the surface and accessed, often through physical means. Yeah.
You've just touched on a word that I was going to bring up next, which is trauma.
Mm.
I had always viewed that word and that idea as, I'll sound silly, but just for I never have an issue of using myself as the guinea pig, hopefully, of it to be of value to someone watching or listening. I thought I couldn't use a word like trauma unless I had something just absolutely completely horrific happen in my life that I'd lived through.
Mm.
And there may be some element of truth to that. Or I think what I'm beginning to understand, and I suppose it depends on an individual perspective and a meaning that we attach to any word or idea, I suppose, Andre. But where I am with it now is that I feel like what could seem like fairly or fundamentally simple things can leave a traumatic imprint on us without us even really knowing it. And that idea of trauma is something that emotionally, like when you're talking about these stories and that trauma being held in the body, if you investigate into things like cellular memory and stuff like that, you'll start to understand how that can get completely reawakened when you're triggered. And then you can actually feel as if you are right back in that moment when you first experienced what that was. And that's trauma, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's the strange and particular thing about trauma is that when you tap back into it, it's very physical, and it's like there's no time has elapsed. It's like you're right back in that original situation where the trauma happened. And so the passing of time doesn't diminish the power of it. It still has the same force because it's kind of trapped inside the body system, and it still has the same force that it had when it happened, and it's visceral. And in my understanding, I would agree it doesn't have to necessarily be a kind of obvious PTSD kind of incident that might create it. It can be something that essentially, I think it's anything that crosses over our boundaries and that we're powerless over, that overwhelms us, even if it's just for a few seconds. And many things can do that. I think actually even things like abandonment and neglect can really create quite a lot of trauma, as well as things like physical violence, of course, which are perhaps more obvious. But I think the key thing is that it's held in the body. It's in the mind, but it's very, very much in the body as well. So that's why I quite like the kind of approach that doesn't just use thinking to deal with things, but goes under that into the physical landscape.
What I'm hearing in my mind as I'm listening to you share is those kind of traumatic moments. They're almost, you could view them almost as story starters.
Well, that's pretty much the way it is, because so the sequence that I think I'm developing is that we have a sort of traumatic moment. I think most people have moments in their background that are difficult. And then what happens is that we kind of react against that, or we cope with it somehow. And that usually involves trying to make ourselves feel better, try to find something to make it go away. And so then we start, but we also kind of carry a story with us at the same time, which is, well, maybe I deserve that thing. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it's my fault. These kind of thoughts. And then as we go on into life, we tend to try and put these things behind us, but we're still carrying those thoughts around with us. So then something happens, and this is where most Hollywood films start, that triggers us, that sort of challenges us and threatens to push us back into that trauma again. And the usual reaction is to run from it, try and avoid it, try not to deal with it at all if possible. But the stakes keep getting risen, things get more serious, and the person in that kind of story has to do something about it. And this is very much the story of the hero's journey that a lot of Hollywood writers use, actually. And in that way of looking at narrative, you get to the middle of the story and you have to face your trauma, basically. So, the trauma is often represented in films by the bad guy or the bad girl, the adversary, the villain, the antagonist. But once that's been faced, once that darkness, that shadow has been faced, then the hero can start to piece themselves back together again and become more whole and more reconciled to themselves and not be influenced by their original trauma anymore. So that's just kind of the way I would conceptualize it.
Along the lines of life story and coaching people to think about the kind of story and the role that they want to play within it, as it pertains to what we were just talking about, I'm trying to think of a way to ask this succinctly, is how to adopt a role and adjust the story in a way that turns and faces that trauma, makes space for it, and allows it to sort of dissolve out of your experience and to move forward in a healthy way. I hope I'm saying this in a way that feels somewhat clear to you, Andre, versus adopting a character that is just going to push harder against it, and therefore, maybe even just inflame the trauma further, suck it up, push it down when the going get tough kind of thing. Because my experience has been that just only makes it worse, or you're just delaying a future rendezvous with a larger version of that trauma. Does my question make sense to you about, changing that story in a healthy way versus almost more of an adversarial, and now we're just delaying this sort of a way?
I think that most of the clients that I have come to me because they've been trying to do it in the second of those ways.
Right.
And it's failing, and they can't figure out what to do next because it's not working.
Yeah, I just need to be stronger, right? I need to be more of a hero.
Yeah. Well, their version of being a hero would be to be overcome it, or ignore it, or smash through it.
Yeah.
None of the above work. In fact, if there's trauma involved, it'll probably make it worse. So what happens is that they run out of road in the end, and in the end, people kind of run out of ideas. And this is where sometimes I think often people will get stuck in things like addiction, because in a way they just haven't got any idea how to deal with it. The hero thing, their version of the hero thing's not working, so they might just self-medicate, and then that brings its own problems as well. So yeah, by the time people come and they want to start the process with me, they've probably exhausted themselves trying to stuff it down or push through it. And what we have to go on then is a bit of a journey to eventually face it. So it's the opposite, really, of what people think they're going to need to do, which is to face it and engage with it and work through it, make friends with it, have compassion for themselves, open up space within themselves where they're not just shutting it all out.
I wonder if you had access to, there was a series of books that I remember when I was younger, Andre. They were called Choose Your Own Adventure.
No.
Did you ever have any experience with those at all?
No.
So they were, I'm reaching back a long way now. Probably 35 years, closer to 40 anyway. And what would happen is that you'd read a certain part of the story, and then you would have a choice. And if your choice was this, it would say, go to page 57. And if your choice was that, go to page 75. And then it would be like this all the way along through the book. Kind of an interesting idea. The reason why I bring that up, I thought of that in that, let's suppose that you can turn and face the trauma. you can have made the decision that you are up for allowing to light the story that you have been telling yourself, consciously or not, and being willing to get involved with crafting a new story. And that you've got a healthy idea of what it really means to be a hero and to face the trauma head on, as you've just outlined. That's all great. But now, how then do we set a path going forward, like identify the story that we want to tell, but also allow ourselves room to choose your own adventure? In other words, not painting ourselves into another corner now by thinking, okay, well, this is the story I'm going to tell, but if everything in life doesn't go exactly according to that script, well, then I'm going to get knocked off course again. In other words, setting a bit of an intention and a path, a story going forward, while also leaving enough room for it to breathe and change and grow. How do you manage your clients through that?
Okay, I think there's two things that I would say to that. The first of them is what I'm trying to develop in my clients is the ability to operate more often from a place where they can choose whatever story they want to choose to be living out. So this is why I think it's helpful to develop this kind of flexibility in people so that they can. I do have to equate it, I think, to martial arts. That's my best sort of illustration of this, which is the ability to sort of move in different directions, like in Tai Chi. But it all seems to rest on a place of poise. It seems to all sort of flow from a position of being able to move freely. And I think once people can move authentically from their center freely, they can really sort of adapt and move into different positions without getting stuck in any one thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is going back to this sort of archetypal type of storytelling. It does seem to me that what happens once people have kind of faced up to their shadow and integrated with the things that they've been avoiding is that there seems to be a move from the ego, what I would call the egoic or self-centered approach as to what I want for my life, into a much more open, hospitable approach to working with other people, perhaps more, collaborating, but also looking to serve the wider world. And so in that sense, the story kind of changes anyway, because it's no longer about me pursuing whatever that objective was, whether it was a new car or a job or a lifestyle or whatever. Now it becomes something different, which is about the common good and about working with other people in a more of a sense of service. So it's not really that dissimilar to things like the 12-step program in AA, for example, where there's a sort of real shift from individualism and self absorption, I suppose, into service of other people. So I think for me, those are the two kind of immediate responses I'd have to that. I think, because I agree, it's not going to help people too much if they just go from one story that they're stuck in into another story that they're equally stuck in.
What about constantly looking back or digging up old stuff because, well, for whatever reason, I was going to say, because you're programmed to look for it, versus looking ahead at the story that we want to tell? Maybe to ask it another way, can it become unhealthy to some extent? And maybe I'm being selfish in asking this, because I've become quite fascinated with, as I mentioned earlier, how these sort of unconscious ideas and stories can surface years after you've really been investigating, doing the work. There's there's another phrase, and thinking that you were open and willing, and that years after that something can come up and there could be some light shone on it, and then just every part of your being immediately jumps to life with realizing, like I didn't even realize. But if you're constantly going back and reading books and looking at things and tuning in and getting into the body, can you overdo that, Andre?
Well, this is, I think, I think you can. Well, there's a couple of things to say. I think you can overdo it if you're going raking back over the same ground over and over again.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's not usually very helpful. I think what I find more helpful with clients is if I'm looking back to find the untold stories that they haven't been aware of, rather than going back and back and back over the same ground over again. So usually there's a lot of untold stories that they've edited out, because narrative making is a whole system of editing, really. So by the time they get to talk to me about what their story is, they've edited out about 50% of it, and they've probably even forgotten a lot of it as well. So I think looking back is okay. I mean, it's okay in terms of understanding stuff and how we get to be the way we are, but it's in terms of change, it's useful to look at what's being missed, the sort of exceptions to the rule when things worked completely differently in a really positive way. That's often missed. The other thing, though, about what I think you're describing as being quite sort of inward looking, is for me the end product of all of this is outward looking, and it's about service, it's about serving the world, it's about engaging with other people, it's about dialogue, not monologue. That's one of my big things, actually. My writing is talking about how stories should shift people from monologues, where they're simply going round the same loop, into a dialogue when they're engaging with other people and able to more improvise. That's another word from my drama days. Improvise something that they haven't got control of, really. They're just part of some bigger flow.
I remember that from our first conversation.
Yeah, I was just thinking
monologue and the dialogue.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly timed. The question that I had for you next in regards to crafting the story that you wish to tell is, what about the other characters?
That's the big shift, I think, is the shift from, in a way, making a world up in our own minds and populating it with our versions of other people, to truly and deeply engaging with other people as they are rather than how we'd like them to be. And that's an exercise in, that's a big shift, actually, because that means letting go of our own perceptions, our own version of reality, our own version of other people. And so, even classic coaching exercises like listening exercises come in really useful with that, because that gets people into the territory of empathy towards what's going on with other people. And to me, in many ways, that's the end product, I suppose, is to get to that point.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly what you said about other people seeing them as they are, as opposed to the way that we want them to be.
Yeah.
And then you paused and said that's a pretty big shift. That's a big shift, but it's a critical one, isn't it?
Yeah.
We want to be happy.
Yeah, I think so, because otherwise we're going to torment ourselves and torment them with a version of who they are that is almost certainly not accurate, and sometimes quite negative as well. And I think that's really can be very destructive in relationships in particular. Is that each person having their own version of the other one, and that means they're only going to hear the other person through the filter of that version. So anything that doesn't conform to that, they won't see and hear. It gets filtered out. So that's how things get stuck. And so my work would be about helping people break out of that by listening, empathizing, and discovering something new that they hadn't been aware of before.
You're starting to touch on, we're in synchronicity here, Andre. It's almost as if you know what question that I'm thinking of asking next. And in this case, it is how to handle, or what about the stories that we're telling in our minds about other people and what they think, and in often cases what they think as it relates to us. You mentioned the scope of relationships, And boy, that's, in my experience, that's been such a challenging thing, where you mentioned earlier about how when trauma jumps up, it is a very physical experience. It's almost a Jekyll and Hyde kind of a thing. When it happens for me, I'm much better with it now. I can recognize if it's happening. But I had an episode not all that long ago where I just wasn't myself.
Mm.
Physically, I felt like I wasn't even in control of myself. And I was telling my story, or a story, about what someone close to me was thinking about me that wasn't true. But for me, it felt real. So in this case, for the benefit of the listener and the viewer, I'm not talking about a story so much about how I want my life story to go, but now here's another extension of another story I'm making up about what someone else is experiencing. I hope I'm making sense, Andre. I better stop talking. Can you bail me out here?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much what I'm referring to, which is we're just storytellers. We can't stop ourselves. We're doing it all the time.
Yeah.
You know, human beings just, I mean, some people would argue that we are stories, you know, we're the very fabric of ourselves is story. And we just can't stop telling stories about other people. A lot of the time, those stories are very inaccurate and very partial. And the reason for that is that we're telling the stories based through the filter and the restrictions of our own narrative. And so that only allows us to see people in a particular light. And we therefore miss quite a bit sometimes that doesn't conform to our kind of constructed template for how people are. But when that's happening in a relationship, it's really it's really tricky because the other person then feels it. They feel that they're being constrained and kind of controlled, perhaps, by our story of who they are. And they, you know, it's an uncomfortable place for them to be in. And that's why relationships can break down, because there's not a meeting point in the middle between our reality of what we think is going on and what's really going on. It's not the same thing.
Let's talk about the podcast and the book for a few minutes, if you would.
Sure.
The podcast already came up. Pivot Points with Andre. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, it's going to be called Pivot Points. I'm still thinking about whether to put my own name underneath it, but it's definitely going to be called Pivot Points. Yeah, yeah.
How are you investigating? How are you imagining it to work, like formatically? What kind of a podcast delivery are you envisioning?
Well, it'll be a conversation, a bit like this. You know, that conversation is what I do. It's what I've done for a long time. It's kind of my bag. So it sort of works for me to just chat to people and have the dialogue. The format of it will be pretty simple, I think, because I want to talk to people who have gone through some kind of significant change. Could be in any part of their life. Could be in their career, relationships. Could be to do with spirituality. Could be anything really. But I want to get at, in my mind, a pivot is when somebody, you know, starts from a point A, they jump from that point, they turn in midair, and then they land in a different place. So for me, there's 3 stages to it, which is the kind of launch, the turn, and the land. And so when I'm talking to people, I want to talk to them about how did they get into a position to be able to change. And oftentimes that involves talking about their friends, their allies, their coaches, who's cheering them on, where are they getting help from, that kind of thing. And then the turning point itself, I think, is really fascinating because I don't often hear people really unpack that, the actual moment or point where the shift happened. And then the final thing is how they land in a different place and sustain it as well, how they kind of go forward from a different position. So it's a 3-stage kind of format that I'll use. And I've had my first interview with an actor that will be coming out probably in the next week. And the way we'll probably do it is that people will recommend other people to come on it. So it'll be like a kind of chain effect of recommendation. I think that's how we'll do it.
You've also got a book in the works, I think, as well, don't you?
Yeah. So the book is really on the same topic. It's basically all the stuff we've been talking about now. And that will be, I think that will probably be called Pivot Points as well, with maybe a subtitle that's different. But it's the same kind of idea, very much about story coaching, using a lot of my acting techniques. It's very much a manual, I suppose, as much as it is a book about theories. I want people to be able to take it away and do stuff with it and put stuff into practice. So there's loads of exercises in it that are really practical for people to change their embodied story. Yeah.
And the website of yours at andreradmall.com is being tinkered with behind the scenes.
Yeah.
At least in part to maybe coincide with these two things, along with everything else that you've done, because you do have a couple of books that are already out and available.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got a couple of things out. One's on addiction, one's on holistic healing. And they can both be accessed through Amazon. So yeah, this will be my third book, which is exciting. It's the one I've spent the most time on as well. I've spent a couple of years getting this one ready. It's a big project. Yeah.
Yeah, a book is a monster, isn't it?
So, yeah.
To get to your third, that's incredible. With the website in redevelopment, what are some ways that people could reach out to you? I don't know if you have. I didn't ask you ahead of time if you have any coaching spots or opportunities available. But in case somebody really resonates with what you've shared here and might like to reach out to you now or in the future, what would be some ways that they might be able to do that, Andre?
Yeah, so people, I mean, probably the easiest platform is LinkedIn. So my profile and all my information is at LinkedIn at Andre Radmall, just my name. So that's easy. You can reach me through there, you can message me through there. I'm on Twitter as well. It's at Radmall Andre. So it's slightly different. It's at capital R Radmall, capital A Andre. So that's my Twitter handle. I'm also on Instagram as well, just Andre Radmall.
This time always goes by too quickly, but I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to catch up with you. I'm really glad that you and your wife both have made your way through the virus okay. I didn't realize before we had connected that the experience was that close up for you. But I find it really interesting, Andre, how we can have conversations with people that we haven't even met. And yeah, I can't speak for you, but I feel strong friendships and close connections with people like you from having shared these kinds of conversations in an effort to try to share something helpful with others. And I'm really grateful for you. I really appreciate you, and I'm thrilled that we got the chance to do this again. Thank you for this time, and best wishes of continued health to you and your family.
Thank you very much for having me on, and I've really enjoyed talking to you again as well. Great stuff.
We'll do it again someday, Andre. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
Andre Radmall, who is a life story coach. And again, you can reach him primarily right now on his LinkedIn profile. When I put this up on noscheduleman.com as a blog post for this episode, I'll make sure that I include all those links to Andre and the books that he has already out. Insight into Addiction is one of them, and Holistic Healing is the other. If you type his name into Amazon, you'll find those and more about Andre as well. I want to say thanks to Diamond and Gold Treasures, Mo Mondays London, Mulligan Realty Group, Provincial Glass and Mirror, and Trickett Financial for their support of Journeys with the No Schedule Man. A reminder to please, if you found this helpful, just do take a moment and subscribe wherever you may be watching or listening. If you feel inclined to leave a review, that's helpful to us as well. And you can stay in touch with me and learn more how to work with me, coaching, speaking, future podcast episodes, and all of that kind of stuff at noscheduleman.com. On behalf of Andre Radmall, my name is Kevin Bulmer. This is Journeys with the No Schedule Man. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.